Well, I'm here today to discuss with Jon Lunn the publication of this work, Importunity, which has just come out, available from all good bookshops. And one of the things that I can say is that the texture of this novel literally is wonderful. It feels fantastic. The print is great. So I have to congratulate the publishers on doing such a wonderful job. And of course, the designer for really what is a wonderful cover, I think. But I'd like to begin with a few questions to Jon.
Sure.
So Jon, it's no secret that this book has been long coming in one sense. I know that you only started writing it a couple of years ago, but it's been gestating for a long time.
Yes, I've given birth to something.
That's right. So can you just tell us a little bit about that history?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it goes back to my doctoral research in the 1980s when I was out in Zimbabwe, newly independent Zimbabwe, going to the archives every day and burrowing away, looking for information about the railway system, which was my topic. And obviously in the course of that kind of research, you come across all sorts of things. And what I came across was the transcripts of two sensational trials, both in 1923, involving a white railway worker by the name of Iworth Jones. And these trials intrigued me enormously, but I could never really find a way of weaving them into the doctoral research itself, which, these things tend to be at the macro level, don't they? Individual stories don't always find their way in. So I put it in my back pocket after I finished my doctoral research and went away, always thinking maybe I'll come back to it, maybe I'll do something with it. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, I made periodic attempts to find out more as a historian about Iworth Jones and the circumstances around these two sensational trials.
So you describe these trials as sensational, and so what made them sensational both to you as a historian and to the society at the time?
Well, I think both trials illustrated vividly the fault lines within settler colonial society in colonial Zimbabwe, as it was then. Where obviously race and racism were absolutely central to the whole system. And in the first trial, the character Iworth Jones, the real person Iworth Jones, the character followed later, defends his black domestic servant against his wife's charge of assault. A very unusual thing to do for a white husband to betray, inverted commas, his wife in this way. That obviously caused a massive disturbance in settler society, so much so that within a matter of weeks, he was tarred and feathered by an outraged gang of vigilantes in Bulawayo, leading to a second trial, the trial of the vigilantes for tarring and feathering him. The trial proceeded. They were found guilty because it was almost impossible for them not to be found guilty. But the community rallied round and paid their fines. They got a relatively light sentence, and the community paid those fines. And Iworth Jones was sort of cast into outer darkness. He was thrown out of settler society, seen as a pariah as a result of his actions. So these two trials, really, just ignited my imagination. But as a historian, I sought to fill out the gaps by interviewing people, looking for further archival material, always getting somewhere but not far enough to write it as history. And so the time passed, and finally in 2021, just after I'd retired, I decided, why don't I give it a go and write it as a novel? I'd always wondered if I could write it up as a novel in the absence of enough historical information. So I set out to try and do that. I wasn't sure if I would get beyond page one, but for better for worse, I started and I finished. And here is the book in front of us today.
And congratulations on that. At the same time as I was reading your novel, I was also reading Doris Lessing's memoir of going home to Southern Rhodesia. And I did note that at one point in that memoir, she talks about a rather reactionary and very powerfully built man who's warning her about showing too much favor to Africans and too much criticism of the white society that she's now writing about. And one of the things that he does is that he hands her a matchbox, and in that matchbox is a feather with some dark matter on it. And it's only through reading your novel that I actually understood what he was saying, that obviously, as you say, it was in the repertoire of outraged racism, basically, of that time. So I've mentioned Doris Lessing.
Yes.
Nobody who's read your novel will escape the fact that the main female character, Yolo's wife, is called Doris. Anybody who reads the preface will be piqued by the fact, will be intrigued by the fact that Doris Lessing actually wrote to you about this novel, and indeed whether you should write a novel about this man at all. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, Doris Lessing is just a giant of literature, and I've read Going Home as well, and The Grass is Singing, and she explores so many issues and themes which recur in this novel, perhaps sort of deployed differently in this case, but I'm enormously inspired by her anatomies of settler colonial society, much closer to the time in which they still existed, of course, and she fled from it eventually, came to London. But yes, I wrote to Doris Lessing, and I'll come back to the character in a moment. I wrote to Doris Lessing in 1997 when I was struggling to find out more historical information, and I just thought, well, what have I got to lose? I'll write to her. Did she know about this guy? Had she heard of him? And if so, did she have anything she could tell me about him, and maybe other individuals who knew him and who might be willing to speak to me about him? She very kindly wrote back fairly promptly, and said no, she hadn't heard of him, and she had a lot of fellow feeling for him given his opinions, so she was very sympathetic. She said she didn't think she knew anybody who would know of him. She was a Salisbury person, she said. With Jones, Yolo James is a Bulawayo person fundamentally. So she said, I don't think I can help you really. And then she posed a superb question which kind of affected my behaviour for another decade or so. It's a great question. She asked, does it have to be fiction? Because I'd said I was tempted to write it up as a book if I couldn't find out enough historical information. And on the strength of that, I thought, well, no, it doesn't have to be fiction, and I'm a historian, so I better go and have another go. And sort of went off and did so. And still didn't really get that far, and hence coming back to thinking about writing it as a novel, sort of 16 years later, 15 years later.
Well, John, as we're on the subject of Doris, I wanted to point out, what I thought was a kind of correspondence in your themes. Many of the great themes of the early Doris Lessing, prior to the science fiction and and what struck me, many things struck me, but one of the things that struck me about your novel was that it is as much about the settler wife, if you like, being victimized by the dreams of the settler husband, which is really the story of so many of the short stories. It's really the subject of so many of the short stories of Doris Lessing. The Second Hut, as one example. And, your novel is really as much about that as it is about the the racial order and the oppressions and the discriminations intrinsic to it. And I just would like to hear how you reflect upon the link between your novel and Doris, despite the alleged lack of link between your character Doris and the writer Doris Lessing.
I was influenced by Doris Lessing's writings, but as a historian, I'd seen in the archive, so to speak, the evidence of these sorts of dynamics as you've described them. I think that Doris is, she's not an enormously sympathetic character in many ways, but she is, unlike Yolo, very typical of her times, exemplifying various things. And I wanted to sort of burrow beneath the surface of how a woman like Doris can emerge, and what's impelling her to behave in this way or that way in different situations. And what is true of settler society is that white women are more vulnerable, although part of a privileged group. Within settler society, they're required to embody the values and to uphold the culture. But when they fall from grace, there's often much less scope for them to recover, to find a new way forward. I mean, at the time of the trial in 1923, Doris seems the ideal victim, as far as settler society is concerned. Yolo seems the person who's gone beyond the pale, and it looks like he's the one who's going to be ostracised and isolated, possibly for the rest of his days. But as the book describes, he finds his place again, he finds a way back in. Doris, however, even at that moment where she is ostensibly being supported by all and sundry, is in the throes of a massive crisis that has come from the failed expectations of that marriage, and Yolo's failure to play his part as a white settler male in settler society. And so she's on the verge, or in fact already having a breakdown. And in fact, her accusation against Michael, the black domestic servant, comes out of her breakdown, which comes out of the failure of her marriage. And so, I'm exploring those tensions and pressures that the white settler wives were under, and also the unforgiving nature of that society for those who then, failed to live up to the values that they were supposed to embody, and from which, her breakdown, there was no coming back ultimately. Maybe another woman would have come back or would have found a way back, but Doris, unfortunately, it's a tragic ending to the novel for her. I had some mixed feelings about that, in the sense that here I go, sort of making a woman the ultimate victim again. I don't feel comfortable with that. But it is a harsh truth of settler society, as I'm attempting to portray it, that all too often, that there was no safety net. The disgrace was, deeper and more permanent for white women who fell outside of the acceptable parameters of behaviour. So it's a story. Yes, it's a story about race, but it is also a story about gender relations within the white community, and but also just the complexity of people, for all of the grand narratives of settler colonialism, just how individual traits of personality and experience are played out, sometimes in ways that are repeated, and others, and sometimes in other situations where it's a completely unique situation. It isn't replicated.
Jon, as you pointed out, there is this tragedy within the life and marriage of Yolo and Doris that you explore in quite a lot of detail, and using the mental institutions of the time and so on to evoke this great tragedy. But there are, of course, other tragedies that are taking place within this novel, and in fact, in some ways, the novel rolls towards a conclusion focusing on those tragedies which relate to the fate of the African characters. And it seems to me that what you were doing in this novel was trying to give the reader a sense of the history through which the black characters had lived, a real sense of that history, but also just the crushing impact of the racial order, the discrimination, the way in which people inevitably encountered prison. And is that a kind of reasonable reading of...
Very much so. I mean, I began with those two trials, and I mean, Michael, who is the third main character in the novel, along with Doris and Yolo, he's the African domestic servant the archive doesn't give him a name. There is zero information. I mean, all we have about Doris, by the way, is the actual name of Iworth's wife, Alice, as it happens. He's not even named. So I wanted to create as far as I could within my own limitations, because my own historical experience and personal experience comes into these things. I can have no direct experience of what it is like to live as an oppressed person within a racial order that is as unjust and brutal as settler colonialism was. But nonetheless, people were trying to survive and live, and I wanted to at least try and give that character a real history, and also a trajectory to a significant extent going forwards after the book, because he does survive. I mean, that's a spoiler alert. Michael survives, but he's reflecting on his experience in relation to Yolo, but in relation to that racial order more broadly, and he's drawing conclusions which maybe general readers might be less familiar with than some of the other conclusions that might have been drawn around the possibility of overcoming that racial order and reaching across, as Yolo would see it, to create those solidarities. And of course that is possible and desirable, but if you have experienced what Michael has experienced, you might well be inclined to err on the side of thinking it isn't possible, and that the best thing would be to have no contact and for the settler population simply to remove themselves, to leave, and this is an African country, and the Europeans, the whites, should go. So there are these undercurrents which perhaps we're seeing come more to the surface again of the Pan-Africanist current, the skepticism about multiracial democracy, the possibility of building these new societies of the kind that the ANC and Nelson Mandela and the Freedom Charter embodied. And so Michael is pessimistic, if you want to put it that way. He's optimistic in that he can see independence coming, but he's not optimistic about sort of happy clappy ebony and ivory outcomes. Where everybody suddenly lives together in harmony and history comes to an end. And so he expresses that in his own way. He's not an ideologue, so he's not writing a manifesto. And I just wanted to explore that, as a different set of feelings about settler colonialism, and which we do need to engage in, because these undercurrents are still there and still with us. We might wish they weren't, and we could have that ebony and ivory ending. But the truth is that these societies are still wrestling with the legacies of settler colonialism, and the sheer brutality of them just cannot be underestimated.
And I think one of the things that this novel really does is that it shows through a set of different scenarios, if I can use that word, both the workplace, master-servant relations, the prison, just how harrowing that experience was, what the experience of being black in a society like that was. So I'll close on that note, but I just want to remind everybody that this is the book. It's available through bookshops. I know that because I myself have ordered it through my bookshop, which is a village bookshop. And John can tell you which other, how else you can order this book.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from Barnes and Noble. You can get it from the website of the publisher, Carnelian Heart Publishing. It's available via there. And as Jeremy says, available through any good bookshop as well. Please do read it. If not for me, for the publisher, who's just been a wonderful support to me from start to finish. And I look forward, hope to receive feedback from readers over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Jeremy.
Cheers.